Okay, we're recording. Okay, now I will broadcast. Okay. Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our 6th lecture of our Bitesize Animal Law Series. I'm just going to hang tight because it's become apparent that some people aren't getting into the webinar before we start. So we'll just hold off for a few moments until I can see that roughly the same amount who've signed up are in, okay? And those of you who got in, can you hear and see us okay? Just do a virtual wave. Perfect. Okay. Thank you all for your patience. And the new ones who've just joined, can you all hear and see okay? Okay, perfect. Okay. I'll just wait a few more moments. Excellent. Okay, we'll get started. So thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Thank you for those of you who have been with us since our very first lecture, and thank you to those who are just joining in. There's been really great feedback, and we're so thrilled to have you joining us. We just have 2 lectures left to go. And again, thank you all so much for your patience, as we all learn to work through these new technological programs and platforms that work great sometimes, but not so great other times. And dare I say it, I hope technology goes well this evening. We hope you're enjoying our series. And just before I introduce our speaker for this evening, I'm just going to go through how to participate in the Q&A. I apologize to those who have heard this several times now, but for those who are just joining us this evening, I want to make sure you know how to participate. So you'll see at the bottom of your screen the little Q&A icon. So if you do want to submit a question, please just type your question into the Q&A icon. If you do want it to be anonymous, please just select submit anonymously so that Steve and I cannot see your names next to your questions. And lastly, there's a great feature that if you see a question you equally would like to have asked, you can just vote the question up so we can see which questions may have gained popularity and ensure we answer those ones. Okay. And then again, just make sure you pop your question into the Q&A rather than the chat. That's where we're going to draw the questions from. All right, and those who've joined, can you hear and see okay? Perfect, okay, excellent. So tonight we are welcoming Dr. Steven McCulloch to speak with us about representing sentient animals in public policy. So Steve is a senior lecturer in human animal studies at the University of Winchester. He qualified as a veterinary surgeon in 2002 from Bristol University, and he holds a BA in philosophy from Birbeck College, London University. He has a PhD from the Royal Veterinary College, London University, and for his thesis, the British Animal Health and Welfare Policy Process, Accounting for the Interests of Sentient Species. Stephen's research focuses on the ethics and policy of animal protection. His research has shown how the UK government policy making excludes the interests of sentient animals. Stephen proposes animal welfare impact assessments and independent ethical analysis as key reforms. He has applied these reforms to controversial policy issues such as bovine tuberculosis and badger culling. His more recent work has focused on Brexit, which he argues poses substantial risks to animal protection in the UK, the EU, and internationally. So if you could all join me in a silent welcome for Dr. Steven McCulloch.
Thank you, Tiffany, and thanks for the silent welcome. And thank you to the UK Centre for Animal Law for inviting me to speak this evening. So just to give a little overview of the presentation before I start, first of all, I'm going to talk about sentient animals and policy, what we mean by that. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the exclusion of sentient animals in public policy. I'm going to move on to what animal welfare impact assessment is, what I mean by that. Throughout the presentation, really, we're going to be talking about weighing human and non-human interests in government policy. We're going to talk about the current animal health and welfare advisory landscape in the UK, and then move on to a recommendation for an Animal Protection Commission. So just a note on sentience. Charles Darwin wrote in 1871 in his Descent of Man about there being no fundamental difference between man and animals, non-human animals, in their ability to feel pleasure and pain. This is obviously very important from a moral perspective. Means that animals can suffer, they can have a life worth living, and it means essentially that government policy should be concerned about its impacts on non-human animals. So what's the size of that sentient non-human constituency? Obviously, the larger the size, arguably, the more structures and processes we might expect in government policy. So if you have a look at this graph, we've got the UK, the European Union, and the US. I've included those three because much of what I'll say tonight isn't restricted to the UK, although I tend to use examples that focus on the UK. Essentially, any jurisdiction that has sentient animals, which are all jurisdictions, you know, will have major impacts on those animals with its government policy, and should have structures and processes in place to deal with that. So if we look at the UK, we've got around 70 million humans as a population, as a yardstick. Then we've got about 1,000 million land farmed sentient animals, so about 1 billion, so pretty huge numbers. And then if we look at aquatic animals, we've got about 4 to 5 billion, and these are numbers that we're killing each year. And we've got even more animals, as you may expect, in the EU, nearly 5 billion land farmed animals, and around 10 billion in the US. Just a little breakdown of those figures. This is UK agriculture. The vast majority of these, around 95%, are birds, mostly broiler chickens, meat chickens, and then around sort of 80 million or so fish, 14.5 million sheep and lambs, 10 million pigs, and 2.6 million cattle. So essentially, you know, we've got a huge sentient community that government policy should be seriously considering. So to move back to the UK, some of the research that I've done is focused on bovine TB and badger culling, the issue of large indoor dairies, and the issue of wild animals in travel in circuses. So I'll use examples from these case studies this evening, and just really to make the point at the outset that when I'm talking about reforms, I think you know, it's important to state we could think about ideal reforms. You know, what would be an ideal conception of justice for animals, and then non-ideal reforms. Maybe ideal reforms would lead to some kind of universal rights for non-human animals if we ground our moral status in sentience. But I'm not talking about that. My research is based on what I've called politically realistic reforms, so reforms that are achievable in the next 10 years or so, and also, for that reason, reforms that are kind of based on a current paradigm of animal use, you know, broadly the animal welfare ethic, maybe the unnecessary suffering principle. So another good place to look is Article 13 of the Treaty of Lisbon, which I think is, you know, it's a good statement for those in the animal protection community. There's the recognition that animals are sentient beings, and then there is this prescription to, you know, quite a demanding prescription, I think, to pay full regard to the welfare requirements of animals. So that's quite a demanding prescription. Now, obviously, the UK has now left the European Union at the end of January of this year, but first of all, this is still applicable to the 27 EU member states remaining. Secondly, obviously there's been a debate about replacing this, and the UK government has committed to replacing Article 13. So just a note on the animal protection framework. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about is both related to the formulation of legislation, but it's also related to non-legislative policy, and you'll see that when I talk about badger culling. But just to provide some context, we do have a developed legislative framework in the UK for farmed animals. Most of it is based on EU legislation. We have transport and slaughter regulations. We have general on-farm directive for farm animals, and we have species-specific directives, mostly for the intensively farmed species, meat chickens, layer hens, calves, and pigs. We have the Animal Welfare Act and the Welfare Farm Animal Regs. For wild animals, we have some domestic legislation like the Wild Mammals Protection Act. We have some species-specific legislation like the Protection of Badgers Act, and then we have some international treaties like the Berne and the Bonn Conventions. I'll speak a little bit about non-human animal policy, legislative context for comparison, really. And obviously there we're concerned with the Animal Scientific Procedures Act, and then I'll don't really speak at all about companion animals, which are mainly regulated by the Animal Welfare Act. So I think imagine if you're a government minister, or within cabinet in the UK government, and essentially when you're making policy, you're going to be faced with these sorts of questions. Should badgers be called as part of a broader policy programme to control bovine tuberculosis in cattle? Should the government permit year-round housing of dairy cattle? Should the government prohibit wild animals in travelling circuses? And I make this point here because, these are pretty obviously explicitly normative questions. There's a moral dimension to all policy, because the government policy is concerned with the distribution of goods, and there's a scarcity of goods. It's concerned with making rules and limiting freedom, liberties. But I think with sentient non-humans in particular, obviously there's a fairly, unusual relationship compared to the human context, in that we do use them and harm them for our benefit. And I would argue that many of the ongoing controversies in animal health and welfare policy area are related to the lack of structures and processes in government. So I'm talking about salmonella in eggs going back several decades, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, mad cow disease, foot and mouth disease, and mass culling. More recently, bovine TB and badger culling, and so on and so forth. So a highly controversial area. And given this explicit sort of normativity, the moral dimensions, we'd expect some kind of place where we could objectively, or rigorously discuss the ethics, the weighing of the impacts and the interests of non-humans and humans. So to answer those questions, if you're a government minister, first of all, I expect that you'd want some kind of rigorous process whereby you could measure the impacts of policy options on those animals. And we could call that animal welfare impact assessment, analogous to environmental impact assessment. And secondly, we would want that ethical process, that way of weighing human and non-human interests. Okay, so how does the government make policy? Obviously, policy making, for those who've looked into it, will be aware it's extremely complex. One sort of way to understand it is multi-level governance theory. So, for example, policy in Westminster is affected by international considerations such as the World Trade Organization and post-Brexit trade, the OIE, the World Organization for Animal Health. There was European Union regulation that will continue to influence us post-Brexit. There are other international treaties, policy making at the national level in government, Policy making at a regional level, animal health and welfare has devolved in the United Kingdom. Policy making at a local level, for example, the enforcement of policy by local authorities. So very complex. The ROMEF policy cycle is a model whereby we can sort of break down that complexity and understand it. And as an example, government may have rationale, to maybe, improve food production or maintain food security in the dairy context, or to reduce animal disease. And more specific objectives might be, say, to control bovine tuberculosis and with respect to the reservoir and badgers. Now, what the government then does, the government might have a preferred policy option, a lead, but the government has a duty to look at different policy options. This is, good policy making, and this is done at the appraisal stage. And this is really where I'm mostly focused on with my work. Okay, so we've talked about the moral dimension, but what's that sort of moral framework? The principle of unnecessary suffering is probably, the broad moral framework by which we regulate animal health and welfare policy. And as Mike Radford states in his 2001 book here, who spoke last week, it's kind of the benchmark for the proper treatment of animals. Now, Mike is talking about the legislative context, but obviously the law in some sense reflects morality. And that seems like a nice, easy answer, but actually I think it's a bit more complicated than that, because, it's really sort of kicking the can down the road, because we can look at the suffering element of that, and we can say, although it can be difficult to measure animal welfare in animals, it's an empirical, state of the animal. We need to make some judgments. There may be some disagreement, but we can park that and say that's that's all we can do with that. But the necessity is a little bit more complex, I think. What do we mean by necessary here? If we cause an animal harm, the necessity must be some kind of human good, presumably. But then there are different types of human goods, and I think most of us think unnecessary suffering, means that we can't cause animals suffering purely for trivial goods like entertainment, because we've, say, banned cosmetic testing, we've banned wild animals in traveling circuses. But then there's potentially a slippery slope, because what about fishing? What about horse racing? Even the necessity of consuming animal protein is being challenged now, and dietetic associations state that we don't need to eat meat. So there's some, interesting issues here. Essentially, the point I'm making is it doesn't really answer the moral question. It seems to, but it doesn't. So just a note on sentient non-humans used in experimentation, because my research and much of what I'm going to talk about is more focused on DEFRA. The animal experimentation policy area is the Home Office is responsible for this, and actually it's got a more developed system, probably similar to what I'm arguing for, although I think there are a lot of problems in this policy area too. But animal experimentation is regulated under the 1986 Animal Scientific Procedures Act. There's a mandatory body, public body, the Animals and Scientific Committee. And at the local level, there are animal welfare and ethical review bodies. And where it's a little bit more developed, there's a sort of an explicit moral, there's an explicit moral framework, which is, some people call it utilitarian. I don't personally like to say utilitarian, because utilitarianism is to do with a single principle, and this is essentially excluding humans. This is, we can only harm non-human animals, but essentially a harm-benefit analysis has to be done, and only those projects, only those procedures that are likely to or potentially generate greater benefit are passed. And also there's some prospective impact assessment which is necessary to look at that. It's a little bit more complicated, I think, because there's Banner's principles and there's some outright bans like cosmetics and wild-caught apes. But essentially there is a process there. So the strengths are that there's some prospective assessment of the impacts. Also, we are, accounting for the interests of animals. The weaknesses, obviously, this is a very anthropocentric, moral framework. Essentially, we're harming sentient non-humans almost always for the benefit of humans, sometimes for other non-humans. Also, the idea that this is the moral framework is sort of cemented, this kind of utilitarian, in inverted commas, framework is cemented in legislation. It would maybe be more difficult to move to a more progressive moral framework. There's the big issue of lack of transparency due to Section 24. Obviously, there's a huge interest by society in all animal issues. So if we look in comparison, if we move back across to DEFRA and look at agricultural policy and I suppose policy on wild animal protection, just walk you through quickly the recent development of policy, evolution of policy in the badger culling context. So we have the Protection of Badgers Act 92 and the Berne Convention, broadly to protect badgers from persecution. The Krebs report, the government commissioned John Krebs to look into the transmission of Mycobacterium bovis from badgers to cattle. Before 97, he reported essentially saying, there isn't enough evidence. He recommended a scientific trial. The independent scientific group was set up and conducted the randomized badger culling trial under John Ball, and that was a big, resource-intensive, decade-long trial. It reported in 2007 that badger culling can make no meaningful contribution to bovine TB. The chief scientific advisor, King, reanalyzed the data and stated that it could, based on a sort of less comprehensive document. Hilary Benn, the DEFRA minister at the time for Labour, announced in Parliament there wasn't to be a cull. Farming, veterinary, the farming industry, the veterinary profession, and the Conservative Party continued to support a cull. And when the Conservative-led coalition came in 2001, they announced pilot culls. When the pilot culls eventually happened, the independent panel that reviewed the efficacy, the safety, and the welfare found major problems with suboptimal culling, meaning that not enough badgers were culled. That's a major problem because if less than 70% of the badgers aren't culled in an area, that can worsen the bovine TB situation. And major problems with welfare, with a free or controlled shooting. It's very difficult to kill badgers because of their sort of anatomy. They're nocturnal as well, low slung, and the shape of their head essentially. That body was later disbanded, and the government reviewed the efficacy and the welfare and so on within DEFRA from that point, and continued with the cull. And up until now, around about 102,000 badgers have been culled. So, sort of moving on a little bit to some conclusions. I don't have time really to talk about, justify, all of these problems, these deficits, if you like, with accounting for the interests of animals in policy, but I'll refer back to some of them later on. Within government, we can say there's structural, resource and procedural deficits. First of all, there's no sort of dedicated department to protect non-human interests. And I think this issue probably verges. I didn't talk about this in my former research too much, so I'm talking about, you know, a department for non-human animals, if you like. There is good rationale, because the problem is DEFRA, looking after animal welfare within DEFRA means there's a major conflict of interests, because DEFRA also has objectives, for instance, to maximise food production, or certainly to increase food production. Advisory bodies like the Animal Health and Welfare Board of England, there's some problems that I'll talk about later. They're dominated by industry and veterinary interests, and they're hopelessly under-resourced. They're not independent. If we look at the resources is quite fascinating, I think. If you consider that the UK is one of the leaders for animal welfare in the world, then if you calculate the actual money that's spent on sentient non-humans, it's very, very small. These are old figures, and they're probably from about 2015, and they're back of the envelope figures, but they'll be, you know, they won't be out in terms of orders of magnitude. Essentially, I just saw on the internet earlier that the government, I think this year or last year, are spending around about £30,000 per household, per human household, to give you a yardstick figure. So perhaps, you know, what, £10,000 per person or so. If you divide the total animal health and welfare spend on sentient non-humans, on animals within DEFRA, and divide that by the number of land farmed animals raised and killed every year, you'll get about 40 pence per animal. But it's even worse than that, because actually a lot of the spend on animal health is not really for the benefit of animals. So bovine TB, which takes up half of the animal health budget, is not really for the benefit of the cattle. It's more for the benefit for the humans and for the farmers, in particular, maybe for the broader economy. And if you look at the direct, what's called the welfare spend, which we can say is just for those animals, it's about 0.23 pence per animal per year. So we've got, you know, massive anthropocentrism, as you like, which I think we all know that the policy process is highly anthropocentric, but I think these figures take it to a different level. From a procedural point of view, there's no real process to assess the impacts on sentient animals. There's no real robust process, and there's no real way to account for the normativity, the moral dimension. So here's an impact assessment, and we're at the appraisal stage now. So government would have its preferred policy, in this case badger culling, and I'll talk about this more later, but essentially what government tries to do is reduce all of the different values to monetary values. And this is because it's difficult to compare different types of value. But the problem is, when we reduce all money to one type, or values to one type of value, other values become excluded. And one of these values is the intrinsic value of sentient animals. And so if you look at these impact assessments, and one of the reasons I focus on this in particular is quite interesting, because both cattle and badgers are both involved as well. You might expect there is some consideration of the intrinsic value of those animals. But under the key monetized costs come, you know, the farmers essentially are losing money per breakdown, as is the government through subsidies. And if we look at the other key non-monetized costs, so the government does kind of try and look at non-monetized costs, there's a strong aversion to a badger cull among many members of the public. So even there, it's kind of interesting in that the government doesn't simply state, you know, lots of badgers are being culled. It's the aversion of the public, and the government have actually funded research into willingness to pay, economic techniques to try and value this aversion of the public. So how are animals excluded? Again, impacts are not directly considered. No real sort of weighing of human and non-human interests in an objective way. and the reduction to through economic valuation. And of course, non-human animals are not economic agents like humans, so so they will necessarily be at least undervalued through that process. So this is just a quick example to show you, I think, another great example of where there's a glaring evidence of a glaring exclusion of animals. This is the Green Book, which is a very important government document produced by the Treasury. It's about 130 or 140 pages long, and this is where the guidance is for departments to actually appraise policy options. As you can see, just to go back to that, the idea is that then the minister who makes the decision can look at the overall impact and provide an objective evidence base for decision making. So if we searched through this book, which I did yesterday, and looked for certain terms, it gives us an idea of you know, what is being included and what isn't being included. And we could look for business, and we'll find that in the foreword. And we could look for finance, and there were multiple terms for finance as well. Essentially, there's lots of terms for anything to do with money and finance and so on. Then if we look at the environment, because the environment's an interesting one, because many of you will be aware there's been a debate about how to value the environment. Does the environment have intrinsic value, and should we consider it this way? Or should we just speak of natural capital? Will the environment be better protected that way? And we find in the contents that there is an appendix dedicated to non-market valuation. Okay, so we do have some consideration there. You see essentially that, you know, the Treasury would like you as a civil servant to try and value the environment initially, and so that we can compare it to other monetary values. And then if we search for animal, Adobe Acrobats gives us the return that no matches were found. So even though we have 1 billion sentient farmed animals in the UK, even though we're a world leader in animal welfare, not a single reference to the term animal, and you can look up non-human and sentient and similar in this very key book, in this very key text. So I would say this is very good evidence of major exclusion. So again, we need animal welfare impact assessment, and we need some process to weigh human and non-human interests. And so what are the arguments for animal welfare impact assessment? I think, you know, for at least most people listening, I think these will be pretty straightforward. The idea that sentiency grounds moral consideration, you know, this we take from the first slide from Darwin. Public concern about sentient animals. If you speak to MPs and ministers, animal welfare issues will be one of the largest contributors to their postbag. And I've been told by an MP and civil servants that that's been the case for the past 30 years or so. And then we have it in law effectively in the Article 13 of the Treaty of Lisbon, and the UK government has promised some kind of equivalent statement in law. There's a recognition that animals are sentient, and the Commission and member states must pay full regard to animal welfare. And how governments normally pay full regard, which means to look at the impacts, they generally do impact assessments. And because this is a presentation for lawyers, and because lawyers like precedent, and many people in government are lawyers as well, we do have some precedent. We have environmental impact assessment, very well established process to look at the impacts on the environment. And if you look at this quotation here from gov.uk website, you know, you could swap the words animal for the environment, and it would make absolutely perfect sense. Okay, so animal welfare impact assessment, how would we do this? In terms of a government process, this is, you know, one way to do it. and this is one way that I've done it with my colleague Michael Rice at UCL. We split it into 3 stages. First of all, species description. Secondly, harms and benefits list. And thirdly, an animal welfare impact analysis. The species description would include important, potentially morally relevant information, like whether it was a wild animal or a domesticated animal, whether it's protected, the population size, the natural lifespan and normal lifespan, and so on. The harms and benefits list I really conceive as a kind of a brainstorming exercise, really, probably done within a committee format with a number of people. And then the output really is the animal welfare impact analysis. And this would assess the impacts on each species of animal impacted by government policy for each government policy option under consideration. And it would look at the positive impacts, both the positive welfare impacts and the life impacts, and the negative welfare impacts and the number of deaths as well. So here's an example of a species description. This is taken from, I think, a 2017 paper by myself and Michael Rice. This applies animal welfare impact assessment to the badger culling issue in the UK. So this is just standard empirical information. The reason this might be important, for example, is, you know, there's around sort of 5 million cattle globally. You know, there's around nearly 2 million in the UK. Compared to that in the UK, there's probably around 300,000 or 400,000 badgers. We tend to value things more when there's less of them, whether it's gold or whether it's you know, rare breeds of cattle or whatever it might be. And so, you know, this is maybe an important consideration, the lifespan of the species. And here we have an animal welfare impact assessment analysis table. And so there would be one of these for each policy option for each species affected. So you would have a number of these tables. So I think in this paper we had 6, one each for the badger and cows, for a do nothing approach, for badger culling and for badger vaccination. And these figures are actually, many of these figures are based on, or some of the figures are based on, a Natural England 2011 document. And that document was published so that to make sure that the UK was not in contravention of the Berne Convention, because it's illegal to cause local or mass extinction of a wild species. So the government asked its agency to look at this. But this is a good example of how government incorporates the interests of a wild animal. It essentially isn't really concerned, or not in a serious way, about the welfare impacts on individual animals. It's concerned only about the species. But from this and other figures, we can make some calculations. So, for example, based on the independent expert panel, the suboptimal killing causing welfare issues, you know, we can say that, you know, around 6,500 badgers have short intensity, strong intensity suffering. There's, you know, lesser suffering related to stress related to perturbation, you know, farmers and landowners sort of shooting in the area and reducing population sizes. These 401 badgers benefit because they would be suffering. Badgers, only a small minority, very small minority of badgers actually seriously suffer from bovine tuberculosis, because it's a disease that has a long disease course, and badgers tend to only live for, I think it's 4 or 5 years. But those tuberculous, those badgers that are tuberculous are suffering, would actually benefit from being killed because they don't have a life worth living. And in the badger culling policy issue, I've summarized this as the killing impacts, because they're probably the more important impacts. And you can see the 3 different policy options here: do nothing, badger culling, and badger vaccination. And in the do nothing policy option, and this is why, you know, number of actors, organisations, the farming industry, the government, the veterinary industry, and so on, is concerned because we're killing. This is over a 9-year time frame. Bovine TB isn't being controlled very well. Cattle are reacting and being culled, and nearly 93,000 cattle will be culled in a do-nothing policy. No badgers will be culled. In a badger culling policy, this is based on 19% reduction in bovine TB, which is pretty optimistic figures based on the controversy around the science, based on some government figures. It's based on the Natural England figures. This means that a 19% reduction in bovine TB would mean around 18,000 less cows will be killed. But that is based on killing 85,000 badgers. And then we can work this out. Essentially 4.8 badgers are being killed for every cow. Okay, now this wouldn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't cull badgers. This is just another input into the policy making process, but this is properly and systematically looking at the impacts of different policy options on the animals. If we look at badger vaccination, this is based on a model. It's essentially less effective in this model than badger culling, but of course we don't get any badgers being killed. So the purpose of that was not to argue about the rights and wrongs of badger culling. It was to illustrate animal welfare impact assessment. But that only really gets us halfway, because we're still left with these normative questions. Should we cull badgers? Should we permit year-round housing of dairy cattle? And again, they're normative questions. And in the medical field, it has been realized a few decades ago that we can't answer all of these policy questions simply with more and more science. The information deficit model has been seen to have failed. And certain controversial issues like euthanasia in humans, or abortion, or xenosunt transplantation, these kinds of issues, they require expert moral philosophers, ethicists, lawyers, social scientists, and as an example here, again, a precedent, we have the Nuffield Council of Bioethics. So if we now look at the animal health and welfare advisory landscape in the UK and what we've got, and again, remember, we're talking about 1,000 million or 1 billion land farmed animals. Remember, these are sentient. Remember, this is 15 times more than the current human population. We have some committees, some bodies that advise on these issues. And the Animal Health and Welfare Board of England is a relatively new one. It was established in 2011 under the Conservative-led coalition government. The chairman is Michael Seals. He's an arable and livestock farmer. There's an executive membership of the Chief Veterinary Officer, the Deputy CVO, and the Chief Executive of the Animal and Plant Health Agency, and the Director of Animal Health. And then non-executive members are mostly from the farming industry and veterinary. And I think the idea here is to get a really sort of tight, close, join between senior civil servants in animal health within DEFRA and industry, essentially. But this is a very, very important body in animal health and welfare because, as it states on the website, it's the principal source of departmental advice to DEFRA ministers, the principal source on all strategic health and welfare matters. And I would say personally, there's a problem here, given the membership of this. The members aren't all animal health and welfare experts, as you might expect in an Animal Health and Welfare Board of England, and a board of such importance. And if you're interested in looking into this more, I wrote an article earlier in the year. But the one thing that I focused on was that the Animal Health and Welfare Board of England recommended a few years ago that the codes of recommendations under the Animal Welfare Act, the codes of recommendations for welfare, are essentially repealed and replaced with industry guidance. And DEFRA had this policy for a time period. There was a media furore. All of the animal protection NGOs were opposed to it. Those in Parliament, who generally are seen as parliamentary champions, were very much opposed to it, and for good reason. And I think that this is an example, this is some evidence of a major problem in this body. I don't think it can really fulfill the role that it is intended to do so, and I believe it should be replaced with a fully independent Animal Protection Commission, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. A longer standing body is what's now the Animal Welfare Committee. It started out as the Farm Animal Welfare Advisory Committee after the Bramble Report recommended in 1965 for an independent advisory body on intensive farming issues. It was the Farm Animal Welfare Council, and it was highly respected throughout the world and emulated, and it was a very progressive body. It was certainly progressive with respect to government policy, had a lot of impact. Unfortunately, it was abolished in the 2011 bonfire of the Quangos, again under the coalition government, and it was replaced with an expert committee within DEFRA, so a non-independent body. It's currently chaired by the veterinary surgeon Peter Ginman, and just recently in 2019, it's had its name changed 2019 to the Animal Welfare Committee, and its remit has been slightly expanded. In terms of membership, it's mostly veterinary surgeons, around 10, a few animal welfare scientists, around 4 members of the farming industry, and around 2 ethicists. I've written a similar article again, and this is about the Falk's definition of sentience. 2 years ago, as an expert advisory committee, Falk was asked by DEFRA to propose a definition of sentience. As we saw earlier, sentience is both the capacity to feel pleasure and to suffer. It's positive states as well as negative states, and it's much more than that as well. Falk proposed a very restrictive, in my view, definition of suffering, definition of sentience exclusively focused on negative states. The problem is this could have pretty major impacts, because we saw earlier the Article 13 of the Treaty of Lisbon recognized animals as sentient, and then mandated that the Commission and member states have a duty to pay full regard to animal welfare. Now, if you limit the definition of sentience to just negative states, that would then probably mean that the government doesn't have a duty to promote positive states. So, you know, these definitions will have major impact in the real world on all of those non-sentient and non-human animals that I've talked about. And you might ask why we're getting this sort of these sort of recommendations. I personally don't understand this, because Falk itself in 2009 talked about more of a focus on positive welfare, and within the animal welfare science community generally, there's been a recognition that we've focused too much on negative welfare, and we should focus more on positive welfare. The question has to be asked whether it's related to Falk's lack of independence within DEFRA. This advice was actually given, the letter was written in 2018, but the letter wasn't published by DEFRA until June 2019. And just a note, I think, on the membership of all of these bodies, you've seen that they're dominated often by veterinary surgeons. And veterinary surgeons, and I'm a veterinary surgeon myself, have a very important place in animal welfare, and we should certainly be involved. But I think there is probably there is an imbalance at the moment, and veterinary surgeons, first of all, on expert ethicists, or very few of them are, and that's completely understandable. They're veterinary surgeons. But Secondly, they will bring in their own values, and especially large animal veterinary surgeons, and I'm not saying these values are right or wrong, but probably the two most important questions, moral questions and public policy questions in the farm context are these. The first one is, and this is for the non-human animal context, broadly speaking, is there the moral harm to painlessly kill a sentient animal, something like a chicken or a pig or maybe a badger? Is it a moral harm? Now, probably an awful lot of vets at least would say, as long as we kill those animals painlessly, it isn't a moral harm, it doesn't harm that animal. But actually, you know, there are good arguments to say that it is a moral harm. If you look at the badger culling issue in particular, I would argue that the support for badger culling from the veterinary community, for instance, the BVA, from the farming community, from elements within DEFRA, is probably significantly influenced by the view on that question. Again, not saying it's right or wrong, but we need to have balanced committees, balanced bodies. Now, another issue, another big question is intensive farming, as is ordinarily understood, maybe things like battery cages, and we could say enriched battery cages, or farrowing crates, or you know, intensive broiler farms. Are these bad for welfare? Is intensive farming bad for welfare? And again, veterinary surgeons will, as those that I know, very few would actually say, you know, yes, these are bad for welfare. They might pick up, you know, specific issues, but generally speaking, they won't say in a blanket way that they're bad for welfare. So the BVA, for instance, doesn't have any sort of policy where it, you know, states that intensive farming is bad for welfare. Now, again, I'm not making the claim that intensive farming is bad for welfare, but it's very interesting that the RSPCA, the Compassion in Wild Farming, and as far as I know, all of the major animal protection organisations in the UK do have that position, and also a large proportion of the public. Many members of the public, if you look, for instance, at Eurobarometer studies, also have those kinds of views that intensive farming or factory farming or industrial farming is bad. So again, I don't think we have a balance there. And if we look at the Farm Animal Welfare Committee, now the Animal Welfare Committee, it's quite striking that there is no representation. There are no individuals from the animal protection NGOs, and these animal protection NGOs have a lot of expertise. They're very professional organisations in the modern day, and they're consulted regularly by government about their views. So I find that quite interesting, and I would argue it may be related to this, that we're getting these unusual definitions of sentience being proposed. On a brighter note, if we look at the Scottish Animal Welfare Commission, so this is a new body which has just been established in Scotland. It's been established under an act, so it's an official NDPB. It's fully independent, and if you look down the list there, each one of those individuals has expertise, genuine expertise in animal health and welfare, and there's much more of an even balance between veterinary surgeons and animal welfare scientists, and there's 3 or 4 individuals from NGOs. What you find, by the way, on the Animal Health and Welfare Board of England and now the Animal Welfare Committee, there are some individuals, there are 1 or 2 individuals from NGOs, but they tend to be concerned with or have expertise in the companion animal sector and not the farm animal sector. And again, I would relate that back to potentially the conflict of interest within DEFRA. So the government has proposed and promised that it will replace Article 13. There's been a debate about how government will discharge its duty. to acknowledge, to pay full regard to sentience. And I've proposed a mechanism, animal welfare impact assessment. I've discussed that tonight, and others have proposed that and support it. I've talked about the need for ethical analysis, or weighing the different impacts. The government, unfortunately, has proposed this idea of ministerial report, and what this means is the minister at the end of the year in Parliament would report to Parliament how government has actually accounted for the interest in animals. Now, it should be pretty clear that this is a very inadequate mechanism. First of all, it's retrospective. We need to have assessment before the policy has its impact on animals. We need to have what's called ex ante policy appraisal. And also, you'll realise that it's not actually a substantive mechanism to regard animal welfare. It's the minister actually reporting how the government, has looked at animal welfare. And thirdly, it's not obviously transparent in any way, and we should have full transparency. So I think there's arguments about whether animal welfare impact assessment could be done within government. I think there's been a move to consider that it should be done outside of government, perhaps related to those conflicts of interest within DEFRA, but also the lack of resources. DEFRA funding has been massively cut, I think, by around 2/3 over the last decade or so, and animal health is particularly being cut. So propose an animal protection commission, and the justification is the major democratic concern for non-human animals. Remember the MPs and the ministers' postbags. The basic morality, the idea that animals are sentient, non-human animals are sentient, so they deserve direct moral consideration. And also, I would argue, if Britain is to maintain a reputation for global leadership, England has already been now overtaken by Scotland, then, we need to have this kind of body. So what is the role? Conduct systematic animal welfare impact assessments. The weighing of the impacts on humans and animals, where we do need to have this process somewhere in the policy process. And I would always argue that should be independent of government. I think we've seen the problems with the Farm Animal Welfare Committee of bringing advice within government in such a controversial policy area. And all of these reports and deliberations should be published, full transparency, and also, very importantly, there's an evolving public debate about the use of animals in society, and the Animal Protection Commission should inform that. So, fully independent from government, ideally a statutory non-departmental public body under the Animal Welfare Act, like the Scottish Animal Protection Commission, properly resourced. I think there's a tendency when the NGOs lobby the government to not ask for too much, and I understand that, but I think we need to also remember that, we're talking about all of the resources in government policy making for the 70 million humans is absolutely vast. We're talking about 2 or 3 public bodies, and so for a public body to properly fulfill this role, it would have to be a large body, 20 to 30 experts plus lay persons, and a broad range of expertise in animal welfare, ethics, law, social sciences. I think we need to move away from the domination of science and economics. Science and economics are important, but they're not sufficient. And we need to have individuals from animal protection NGOs. So I think that's the end of my presentation, Tiffany.
Thank you very, very much. Very insightful, and it's generated lots of conversation in the chat and the Q&A. So we'll just take a few questions. So the first question for you is, what is the expected impact of Brexit and trade with USA on reforms?
Well, so if the UK doesn't hold a red line, a commitment to not importing meat and dairy products with, you know, equivalent parity of standards to the UK, then the impact will be very negative, unfortunately. First of all, animal welfare will suffer because of the meat and dairy that we consume. So, for example, if we imported about 1% of the chicken that we consume in the UK, that would equate to about 10 million birds potentially being raised in the US in far, far lower welfare conditions. But I think that a much sort of broader impact would then be that, you know, the farmers in this country, in the UK, would quite understandably then resist any reforms, and, you know, they may lobby to deregulate, you know, to go backwards in animal welfare standards. So, you know, unfortunately, you know, major issues, and this has all been played out before, you know, in the European Union, with a gold plating of, for instance, welfare standards in the pig industry.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, your next question. In the context of MSP Kenny, pardon my pronunciation, McCaskill's welfare-focused questions to the Prime Minister during the Prime Minister questions earlier today, do you think that the current form of the Agricultural Bill 2019-2021 represents a major missed opportunity to give at least some reflection of animal sentience for animals used in agriculture? If you could make one change to the prospective bill, what would that be?
Okay, so the first point on sentience, I personally strongly believe that we should have an individual act of parliament on sentience that effectively replaces Article 13 of the Treaty of Lisbon. I don't think personally that should be in the agriculture bill. I didn't like it when it was first proposed as a draft bill with sentience and sentencing. And if you just think about that for a moment, the importance of getting this right for animals is huge, at least for their lives. And, you know, to publish a bill that's called Animal Welfare, Sentencing and Sentience actually in itself suggests that government isn't taking much note of this. Okay, now if you put the recognition of sentience in the agriculture bill too, I would argue again it's a secondary consideration. It's such an important statement that it should have its own act, and my understanding is that's the current plan. The most important thing in the Agriculture Act is a clause or a provision to prevent in law on the statute book the import of lower welfare products, full stop. Okay, because of the massive impact it would have, and that is by far and away the greatest threat to animal welfare in this country for decades.
Okay, and the second part of that one, moving on to the next one. Why is progress so slow on prohibiting the live transport of animals across the channel for slaughter? The practice seems like such an outlier with respect to unnecessary suffering that everyone, including meat eaters, should be able to recognize it as morally impermissible.
I think my understanding would be that the progress is slow because although live transport isn't important for most of the farming industry, so it will be as, of course, for many in the farming industry, it wouldn't affect them economically at all if it were banned. For some, it wouldn't affect them much, but my understanding is a small proportion of the farming community would be affected much more significantly. And for that reason, the farming industry as a whole, for example, represented by the National Farmers Union, opposes the live export. And so I think it's, really sort of politics, essentially. We shouldn't transport live animals. Many of them are very young, many of them suffer. There's lots of evidence. Also, we're transporting them out of our own jurisdiction, where they could go on to other states with far lower welfare standards, and this is well documented by organisations like Compassion in World Farming. But I think it's important I would love to see live animal exports banned, but I do think it's very important to keep it in perspective. Live exports has, reduced substantially since the turn of the century, and it's sort of in the order of tens of thousands of animals per year. And which is, of course, each one of those is an individual sentient being, but if you compare that, for example, to importing lower welfare goods from the US, if Brexit results in, banning the the transportation, live export of animals, but at the same time importing chickens, it will be a no-brainer that we don't want the imported chickens and the live export goes on. Unfortunately, if you look back at the Conservative policy commitments as well, they've been to control, they've used the word control live exports, and unfortunately the live exports has very much fitted into the Brexit narrative. Live exports couldn't be banned within the European Union because animals are considered as goods, and they couldn't be banned within the single market. Leaving the European Union potentially, from a legal point of view, permits us to do that. But there are other major barriers, the political and economic ones that I've mentioned. And I think those who have supported Brexit in, prominent political positions have, Boris Johnson himself has written an article in The Sun last year, I think it was, talking about banning live exports. And, I fear it's because it really fits into the Brexit narrative.
Thanks very much. Okay, I'll just take one last question. So the question says, do the sentience figures include invertebrates such as insects, lobsters, cuttlefish, and octopi?
So the short answer for is, I was going to say the short answer is no. I'm not sure about the aquatic animals, unfortunately, but certainly for the land farmed animals. I mean, we don't farm many invertebrates anyway. I did see something on TV about someone farming them in London. I mean, there's obviously a question about sentience in invertebrates, which is hugely interesting, probably morally as we go forward, hugely important. But I've really focused on the idea that, we have good evidence of sentience in vertebrates and some invertebrates, so like octopus and squid and crabs. And I think, the campaign by Crustacean Compassion, supported by the bigger groups like the OSPCA and Compassion and World Animal Protection and so on, that they are huge welfare issues. We treat those groups, classes abominably at the moment, and we really need to protect them in law. As for instance, octopus are protected under the Animal Scientific Procedures Act. We need to recognise both cephalopods and crustaceans in law as sentient and protect them accordingly.
Thank you very much, Steve. Just briefly as well, I have seen some people referring to your papers I wonder if you want to share them with me, I can send them out to everyone who had registered for the event.
Yeah, of course, of course.
Perfect. Okay, excellent. So thank you so, so much for giving your time to be with us this evening. It was a very interesting talk. And like I said, there's tons of questions we couldn't get to. So for everyone, I've already put the student group email, but I'll just enter it in again. If anybody does want to send along a question, they have a burning need to find out the answer, just send along the question, and hopefully we can get it answered for you. Next week, we will hear from Libby Anderson from One Kind, and she's going to be talking about issues with wildlife legislation. So we're looking forward to that as well. And thank you once again, Steve, for giving up your evening to be with us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.